Alrighty, so we are into chapter 25. This is a chapter dedicated to the 1960s, and we're going to be looking at obviously John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and the 1968. So before we head into the 1960s, I think we need to talk a little bit about the space program and its role within the Cold War. Eisenhower establishes the the National Aeronautics and Space Administration in 1958. It had been the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, and so by making it into a federal agency, obviously he's putting a great deal of funding as well as importance in what NASA is doing. And of course, a lot of this is precipitated out of the October 4th, 1957 launch of the Russian satellite Sputnik. It should be mentioned that Wernher von Braun and his team came from Nazi Germany. During the fall of Nazi Germany, he and his team were rushed basically out of Germany and brought into the United States. Certainly the United States was very much aware of what von Braun was doing, and mostly what he was doing in Nazi Germany was rocket technology. Probably ultimately, a space program of some sort, but definitely in terms of missile technology and some sort of kind of supersonic technology as well. In December of 1958, the federal government takes over the Jet Propulsion Laboratory and merges that in with NASA. And they begin development of the X-15 rocket plane. This is in production between 1959 and 1968. And by 1959, they've launched Project Mercury, which was designed to put an American into space, pretty much a orbital goal around the world. Nothing necessarily on the moon yet, but Project Mercury will be replaced by Project Gemini, and Gemini would serve 2 astronauts at a time as opposed to just one. And the idea was that they were building the ability for multiple people to go into space at one time. Yuri Gagarin in April of 1961 is the Russian astronaut who ends up orbiting the Earth first, but on May 5th, 1961, Alan Shepard goes into orbit as well. So Americans are catching up, in other words, against the Russians. Stalin dies in 53, and this brings in a period of change. You have 3 men of the who were leading the Communist Party in Russia: Nikita Khrushchev, Malenkov, and Beria. Malenkov and Beria kind of fade out. Beria, I think, is charged with something, and so he ends up being forced out of power, but Malenkov just kind of fades away. You don't really know what happens to some of these guys because, it's the Soviet Union. But Khrushchev emerges as the primary leader. And on February 14th, 1956, he's at a secret Congress meeting in which he basically says, it is here that Stalin showed in a whole series of cases his intolerance, his brutality, and his abuse of power. He often chose the path of regression and physical annihilation, not only against actual enemies, but also against individuals who had not committed any crimes against the party or the Soviet government. That's a quote from his speech, and basically he remarks that the room was completely silent. You could hear a pin drop. But what this signals is the process of de-Stalinization, which means they begin to open up the Soviet Union a little bit more. You could call it the Khrushchev thaw. It's a freer cultural, economic, and political life in the Soviet Union. Now, not too free, and that's the problem, is you walk a very fine line when you start doing that. Khrushchev opens relations with China in 1954. He also visits Yugoslavia, which was a um, communist country, but Tito, who was the head of Yugoslavia, was on friendly terms with the West. And so by going to Yugoslavia, he's trying to um, kind of bridge the gap between the two countries. And then he comes and visits the United States in 1959 in a very highly publicized visit to the country. By October 1964, things have thawed a little bit too much. And so Khrushchev is ousted by Leonid Brezhnev, who takes over as the head of the party and is premier. And Khrushchev spends the rest of his life under house arrest. So when Kennedy is elected, one of the things that he does is he tries to kind of bring a different approach for America into the world. Now, he's very much aware of the Cold War, and he certainly is a supporter of the Cold War and containment theory. He launches the Peace Corps, and the idea here is that American men and women can go out, serve their country, and also help third world countries. But this is also a plan to, there's a Cold War mentality behind this too, because they can go into third world and establish relations with third world countries on the ground. So by 1966, you have about 15,000 men and women who are serving, and it still is a very popular program today. Within Latin America, he launches the Alliance for Progress, which was kind of a Marshall Plan for the Americas. Unfortunately, it doesn't really work out the way it was intended. And a lot of that is because the military regimes and the people in control take most of the funds and don't really spread it out amongst the people. So the plan there was to fight communism and to fight poverty, but the money usually stays in the hands of the political elite in these countries. In 1959, Fidel Castro overthrows Batista, and the map at the bottom left, well, it's not really bottom, but at the left, shows an arrow. Fidel comes in through the southern point near Santiago and marches all the way through to Havana, and that is the path of the revolution. By the time he gets to Santa Clara, Batista, it's New Year's Eve, and Batista basically says, Happy New Year, I'm out of here. And he boarded a plane and took off to the United States. If you watch The Godfather, there's a scene, I can't remember if it was the first one or the second one, where they reenact what happened, and it literally is exactly as it happened. So Batista is removed from power, and Castro comes in, and he nationalizes all of the American land holdings and other investments. Eisenhower, in response, suspends trade and diplomatic relations with Cuba, and the CIA, in turn, begins to train ex-Cuban exiles for an invasion. The invasion, of course, was planned under Eisenhower, and the original plan called for a great deal of air and naval support. But Kennedy sheds some of that, and so he doesn't want to make it as big an operation as Eisenhower had planned, but he still approves it. So Brigade 2506 are a bunch of exiles from Castro's takeover, and they begin this invasion in the Bay of Pigs. Castro takes personal control of the armed resistance of the invasion, and it's a huge disaster for the Americans. The brigade is captured within about 3 days. It's completely gone, and the men are interrogated and then jailed. But it's a huge win for Castro because he's seen as a national hero. And really what I think the Americans thought would happen is that they would see these men arrive, know that they were from the United States, and that they would come running out and trying to overthrow Castro. But the people loved Castro because he did a lot of things for them initially that helped them. He took over a lot of the larger um, property that was in the hands of these landowners that had acres and acres and acres of land, and redistributes it to the average citizen. And so there wasn't much of a local support for getting rid of Castro, and that's, I think, where the United States kind of missed the mark. But it does plant the seeds for the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so basically what Castro is left to do is to try to defend the island from an invasion from the United States in the future. And so he convinces Khrushchev to plant nuclear missile bases on the island. And so the upper left-hand corner, you'll see the map where there were several missile bases that were begun. And so, the United States is flying U-2 planes over the island, and they catch this and they see what's happening, and immediately it's scrambling, because this is, 90 miles off the coast of the United States. This was a huge, huge issue, and really and truly, this is, I think, the closest we ever came to nuclear war. So, what the decision is, they basically come down to several choices. We either use diplomacy, we use some sort of secret approach, where we offer Castro the choice of splitting with the Russians or being invaded. We could do a full force invasion of Cuba and overthrow Castro. We could have an airstrike, or we could have a blockade. And of course, what Kennedy ends up doing is putting a blockade in place. And it's very effective. The Russians tried to break the blockade, and of course Khrushchev gets on the phone with Kennedy and says, this is a violation of international law. But what Kennedy responds back with is, we have to hold this blockade because there's no guarantee that the ships that you're trying to bring into Cuba aren't carrying nuclear weapons. And so they eventually reach a stalemate, and Russia agrees to remove the missile bases if the United States will in turn remove missile bases in Turkey. And so coming out of this, the United States loses the missile bases in Turkey, which was kind of a big thing, but not a huge thing. But the bigger win is the fact that the missiles are removed. And it does create an open channel, what they call the red phone, between Moscow and the United States in Washington, D.C. So, the president could pick up the phone and reach the premier of Russia immediately. November 22nd, 1963, John F. Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas. And these are, the bottom right-hand picture is a picture of Jackie Onassis after her husband has been shot, trying to reach the Secret Service agent that she, trying to get his help. So Lyndon Baines Johnson comes into the White House. One of the first things that Lyndon does is he passes the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, he claims it's in honor of John F. Kennedy. I don't really think Kennedy was Kennedy didn't have a really strong record on civil rights. So this is Johnson using Kennedy's legacy in order to get it passed. But one of the things that Johnson does do is he promotes this war on poverty. He grew up in a very poor section of Texas, and so he knew what poverty was like. And so he creates this domestic policy called the Great Society. And there are a number of different pieces of it, but just to highlight a few, under health and welfare, you have Medicare, which is still in use today, and Medicaid. and then the Child Nutrition Act. So he's trying to help with expanding school lunch programs and food programs for needy children and needy families. Elementary and Secondary Education Act, Higher Education Act, and Project Head Start. Head Start is still around. So trying to push education, the war on poverty in terms of economic opportunity, including creating Job Corps, which was job training and education training. Housing and Urban Development Act, which established new housing programs and made federal loans and public housing grants easier to obtain. Demonstration Cities and Metropolitan Development Act helped revitalize urban areas through social and economic programs. And then the Water Quality Act and Clean Air Act, the Highway Safety Act, and then the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act. So it's kind of a broad spectrum, but really what he's trying to do is put in, on the consumer protection side and the environmental side, protecting the American people, but also protecting the most vulnerable people, which were the ones that were obviously poor and low income. In 1964, you have the Freedom Summer. And Freedom Summer was it was in Mississippi. And what it was kind of implemented by the Council of Federated Organizations, which was a coalition of the four major civil rights groups: CORE, NAACP, SCLC, and SNCC. And the whole goal was to register African Americans to vote within Mississippi. Of course, there's widespread violence. You have over 1,000 people who are arrested. 80 individuals were beaten. 37 churches were bombed or burned. 30 black homes and businesses were bombed or burned. And you have the murder of 3 of the volunteers: James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, whose bodies were buried in a dam. And it ends up, CORE and several of the organizations use their connection with Robert Kennedy to get a federal investigation in on the murder of these men. Also, you have the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party that was headed up by Fannie Lou Hamer. And they attempt during the Democratic Convention to take the seats of the all-white Democratic Party from Mississippi, claiming that they were not representing all of Mississippi, and so they wanted to be able to, they felt they were the right group or justified in order to take the seats of Mississippi in the Democratic Convention. Unfortunately, Johnson does not want to alienate the South, especially with the Civil Rights Act being passed in that year. He wants it to be, so he ends up trying to strike a deal with Hamer and the rest of the group, which they reject, and basically they're turned away from the convention. So this is really the first time we see Johnson turning away from a pretty good fight, but certainly it's due to the fact that he doesn't want to alienate the Southern Democrats. 1964, Johnson is reelected. Hubert Humphrey is his vice president. And Goldwater is an interesting conservative. And he talks a lot about the backlash to civil rights, that there are internal dangers to freedom, the New Deal welfare state stifled individual freedoms and initiative. He calls for private charities for public welfare programs and Social Security, so getting the government out of welfare and Social Security. And he calls for the abolition of the graduated income tax. So certainly a strong conservative in the face of Lyndon Johnson. Another candidate that pops up who runs as an independent um, is George Wallace. And he ends up running again in 1968. At one point he's shot, but I think it's in 68. But he's running on the platform of maintaining segregation. And that's Wallace in the bottom right-hand corner, by the way. In 1965, and we'll talk more about this in the next module, but as a result of Selma, Alabama, Johnson asked for the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to get passed, which of course it does, and it provides a lot more of a bite for enforcement of voting rights. As we've seen other voting rights acts come before Congress, but the implementation of them is very difficult. The Voting Rights Act actually puts federal control in the hand, or for control over voting rights and being able to implement and enforce voting rights, and so it gives it a little bit more teeth. He also passes the Hart-Celler Act, which is, again, influencing immigration. It ends the national origins quota system. It sets up criteria for that's focused on family reunification and demand for skills. So if there's, labor shortages, they can adjust. If they're needing scientists, which of course they are because this is during the Cold War, then they can, it's much more attractive to bring scientists into the U.S. There's an anti-Mexican immigration feel to it, though, 120,000 limit on immigration for the Western Hemisphere. And of course, this is directed at Mexican immigration. But for the rest of the world, it's 170,000 people per year. The one exception to any of this is the refugees from communist countries, that they are exempt from any limit whatsoever. And this is, of course, a policy that will develop further. But certainly what they're looking towards is Cuba, and Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, trying to bring in some of these refugees. And namely, they're looking for the intellectuals, the scientists, the wealthy, well, maybe not wealthy, but the elites from these countries. They're looking for people specifically to help during the Cold War, or help with the Cold War. The Warren Court is probably the most liberal court that we will see, and we're still dealing with some of these issues today. Earl Warren was the Chief of Justice who was put into place by Eisenhower, and we'll talk. I think we've already talked about Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, but Mapp versus Ohio, 1961. Is the ruling comes down that Mapp's Fourth Amendment rights to citizens have a Fourth Amendment right to be secure from search and seizure, and so Mapp, who was not served a search warrant, had the police raid her home, and so because of the violations of the Fourth and 14th Amendment, they should have had a search warrant, and they were not. It was unwarranted federal and state intrusion of her private property. Engel versus Vitale is the prayer in school case, where a non-denominational prayer was to be said. And so the Supreme Court ruled that even though it was non-denominational, the prayer itself was far too religious for the state to mandate that every student pray. And it's also a violation of church and state. Gideon versus Wainwright, which actually has a Florida connection, um, states that all states must provide a attorney in all felony and capital cases for people who cannot afford one. So this is where we get, if you remember, and we'll see this in the Miranda rights, if you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you. And this is based on the 14th Amendment due process clause. Escobedo versus Illinois in 1964, Escobedo was denied the right to counsel, and he ends up making a confession, and the police use that confession to charge him and convict him. The Supreme Court came back and said that incriminating statements made by defense are not admissible as evidence unless the accused is informed of his rights before making the statement, which he was not allowed to do. And Miranda versus Arizona in 1966, that the court held that the police must inform suspects that they have the right to remain silent, that anything they say may be used against them, and they have the right to counsel before the police may begin to question those in custody. And so that's where we get our Miranda rights from. And then Epperson versus Arkansas, 1968. This is the evolution case. The court ruled that a state may not eliminate ideas from a school's curriculum solely because the ideas come into conflict with the beliefs of certain religious groups. So all in all, this is a pretty liberal-minded court. And this turns conservatives, like, it makes them very, very upset, because in one fell swoop, you get rid of segregation, you get rid of prayer in schools, you have all of these, cases where the victim becomes, or I'm sorry, not the victim, but the accused seems to have more rights, and this is how they're interpreting this. And so one of the things that Nixon will do is that he will try to reverse some of this once he is elected president, and we'll see that in another module. So the new right, which can be in this organization called Young Americans for Freedom, they are organized in September 11th, 1960 on the estate of William F. Buckley. It's basically a coalition between libertarians and traditional conservatives, and they create this political manifesto called the Sharon Statement, and it's based around 5 core principles. And remember what we talked about with neoconservatism, and we'll revisit it again when we talk about Reagan. Individual freedom and the right of governing originate with God. Political freedom is impossible without economic freedom, so free enterprise. Limited government and strict interpretation of the Constitution. The free market is preferable above all else, and communism must be defeated, not contained. So we're having a little bit of a military aspect to it. We're having Judeo-Christian tradition, kind of certainly within the first principle. And so this is really the governing belief system of many conservatives really going through Reagan. I think we could probably make the argument that a lot of conservatives today still hold very closely to these 5 principles. On the flip side, the New Left, it's a broad political movement. Major points of concern are civil and political rights, feminism, gay rights, abortion rights, gender equality, and drug policy reform. And there's this kind of push towards opposing what they call the establishment, which when we hit the 1960s in the next module will make a lot more sense, especially when we start talking about Berkeley and the free speech movement. But part of this kind of New Left is the idea that young intellectuals, people like Mario Savio in Berkeley, who we'll talk about in the next module, are the agents for change. That these intelligentsia who are coming out of college are kind of the leaders of tomorrow. One organization, and this isn't, I don't want it to seem like the New Left is embodied strictly by the Students for Democratic Society, the SDS, because they're just one organization that is a part of the New Left. But they're formed at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And they put out this response to the Sharon statement from the right. And you'll get a selection in your primary sources about the Port Huron statement. And that's their 1962 political manifesto, which outlines exactly what the SDS calls for. Keep in mind, there are other organizations that fall into the New Left, but the SDS is really probably the most successful of them, and they really take off. They're formed in Michigan, and they start springing up all over college campuses everywhere. So during Eisenhower's time, well, let's backtrack a little bit. During World War II, Vietnam was occupied by Japan. During the Japanese occupation, Ho Chi Minh and what will become North Vietnamese communists are challenging in fighting the Japanese control. They had been a French colony prior to World War II. The French used them mostly for growing. They had like large plantations. In post-World War II, the French come back and they maintain control. And in 1946, the French Indochina War is launched. And this is the war between the French and the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese communists, who want Vietnam to be independent. By May of 1954, in Dien Bien Phu, the French basically call it quits. And they have asked Eisenhower for help. And so in February of 55, Eisenhower sends military advisors there to help the South Vietnamese, or what he calls the Free Vietnamese, to help fight off the North Vietnamese. So the war changes from a war of colonialism into an internal kind of civil war, you might say. So Eisenhower throws his support behind Diem, who is the president of the Free Vietnamese. The problem is Diem is not a very good leader. And eventually, November 1st in 1963, the CIA take him out, and they put someone else into place that they feel is a stronger leader. The following year, in 1964, we have the Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which the USS Maddox is supposedly fired upon by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. And as a result, Congress basically gives the president, through the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, a blank check in terms of doing whatever he needs to do in Vietnam to take care of the North Vietnamese. By January of 1968, the war, of course, has escalated. You have more and more men that are being shipped off to Vietnam. And you have the Tet Offensive, which is a massive series of attacks up and down the border between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And along, if you look at this map on the right, this is the Tet Offensive. Where those red arrows are, that's actually Cambodia. And so you have North Vietnamese who are coming down through Laos and Cambodia and attacking some of the American military installations. So even though the Tet Offensive is considered to be pretty much a a military loss for the North Vietnamese. What it does show is a coordinated series of attacks, and that the North Vietnamese are not weakened as much as the Americans have thought they were. And so pretty much by 1968, America is beginning to realize that this war is not going to go the way that America wanted it to. When Nixon comes in, Nixon will run on the platform of getting America out of Vietnam. But before he does that, he decides to bomb Cambodia and Laos, tries to bomb them back into the Stone Age. But of course, by 1975, things are just, it's done. And so the United States begins to pull out. Here's a little timeline that will kind of show you what we're looking at. This isn't mine, so don't look at the spelling errors, like right here. It's driving me insane. I didn't do that. Anyway, you can see that Diem and Kennedy are both assassinated the same year, 1963. Johnson becomes president. You have the Gulf of Tonkin incident, the Tet Offensive. The My Lai massacre is a huge public relations nightmare. Basically, you have American soldiers that literally massacre an entire village of South Vietnamese. They believe them to be North Vietnamese sympathizers, but it's seen as an extension of American imperialism and just its murder. And so the commanders are brought to justice and tried, and I think they're found guilty. But anyway, it becomes a major turning point towards America getting out of Vietnam. So before we wrap up with 1968, Prague Spring, this is one of the things that happens in 1968. You have an economic downturn in the early 1960s, and so you have a number of calls for reform within the government. And this goes along with de-Stalinization. And so Alexander Dubček, who assumes the primary party position in Czechoslovakia, calls for what he calls a thaw, which means multi-party politics, not just communist, but other parties as well, freedom of the press and speech. And the students run with this. Citizens are calling for more social, cultural, and political openness, better working conditions, all of this. And so you have literally students taking to the street to protest the government. This has never happened before because the Communist Party would never allow it to happen. And so Leonid Brezhnev, who replaced Khrushchev, considers this a threat against communism. And so his doctrine is, threat against communism is threat against all communist states. And so they come in and he orders the Prague Spring crushed by an invasion. And so by August of 1968, it's pretty much done. But it's a very short period of time in which citizens in Czechoslovakia get a little taste of freedom. And one thing you will remember, or just remember, is that people have a longer memory than we think. And this is seen as kind of the extreme to which the Soviets will allow anything to thaw or freedom to come to any portion of the Eastern Bloc. So 1968 is one of these big years. A lot of things are happening. We've already talked about Vietnam and Tet Offensive. We've talked about the Democratic National Convention and the arrest of the Chicago Seven, who are protesting against the Vietnam War. Robert Kennedy is assassinated. He is running for president and announces his candidacy. And at the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles, he's assassinated. Martin Luther King is assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, at his poor People's Campaign rally where he's talking to a union, garbageman union, and he's assassinated there. Big news, LBJ announces that he will not seek re-election, and this is his admission that he knows that Vietnam has ruined his chances for winning re-election. And so rather than take up the party's nomination, which he probably would have received, maybe, he decides to step aside. It's not just Vietnam, it's also civil rights. He's not going to have the Southern Democrats' support. We have the Prague Spring, as I mentioned, socialism with a human face. You have student protests around the world. And this is the thing that we'll talk about with the free speech movement, that it's not just a movement within the United States, it's a movement around the world. And so the counterculture and free speech movements are very much tied to the student protest. And then Richard Nixon wins election. He wins the election in 1968 under the guise or the promise of Vietnam peace talks, and we'll talk more about that later. So more to come.